Thank you first for the organizers for inviting me to speak. Very happy to be here. So today I'm going to present some ongoing work my colleagues and I, Marco Angrisani and Jinkook Lee, are doing specifically a cross-country analysis on cognitive function, cognitive decline, and financial wealth. Broadly, the objective of this work is to understand how dementia, cognitive decline impacts wealth, and specifically to understand if sort of different pension systems, different sort of retirement planning setups sort of protect people who experience cognitive decline from sort of wealth loss. So let me just jump in. So as we've been talking about all day, aging populations are growing, right? And with that, there's an increase in the prevalence of cognitive decline in retirement. As life expectancy increases as well, we can expect that people need to save sort of more to fund their retirement. And this is particularly true with higher medical expenses as people age and sort of need more of that attention. And most of you probably know that financial decision-making is complex, right? It is not something that is sort of easy to do, especially as people age, right? And this is even harder if you think of people experiencing cognitive decline, right? And as cognitive decline occurs, numeracy skills sort of decrease, fluid intelligence goes down, so it becomes harder to sort of really manage, how you want to spend or even save, right? So part of our objective here is to understand, for people who experience decline, are they protected by sort of certain pension structures? So, for example, imagine a public servant in France or Italy, right? They've been working in government 30, 40 years. Pretty much the only decision, so to speak, they need to make is when to retire, right? And their sort of returns after retirement are based on how long they worked and their salary throughout that time. And if you compare that, for example, in the US to, someone in a private sector job, they have 401ks, they have IRAs, Social Security, early withdrawal rules, annuitization, right? So there's all these kind of complex parameters they need to manage. Now, of course, I'm painting kind of the extremes, but you can think as one system sort of supporting people who experience cognitive decline better or worse than those who don't, right? So really, our question here we're trying to answer is, how does cognitive decline affect financial well-being across different pension systems? All right, so defined benefit, defined contribution. Most of you are probably familiar with this, so I won't get into the details, but point of this slide is to just show how we broadly think of countries as falling on this scale, right? So one can think of the US as mostly being a defined contribution system, whereas, for example, the UK or England and Europe kind of being in the defined benefit bucket, albeit we know every country is kind of moving towards defined contribution, and most countries are really hybrid, right? There's kind of not one or the other. They don't fit in one of these buckets, but broadly we think of them all moving towards defined contribution for reasons you probably all know and can speak to better than I can. But the point is, we will talk about these countries as kind of being more towards kind of one side of the aisle than the other. And so, because financial decision-making is kind of complex, and you can imagine in countries that have more defined contribution style system, right? Our hypothesis was that larger financial losses due to cognitive decline can be observed in systems where respondents must make harder investment and accumulation decisions, right? So, for example, the US. And as such, we expected that the US would experience the most significant losses. And so, similarly, countries where respondents need to make less complex accumulation decisions, we would see smaller wealth declines. And so this is what the analysis that I'm going to present to you kind of tried to get at. So to test these hypotheses, we used longitudinal data sets on aging and retirement. Specifically, we used 3 surveys: the Health and Retirement Study, which represents a population from the US, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, also known as ELSA, which represents a population from England, and the Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe, which represents a population in several European countries, plus Israel. And because we want to understand how individuals who experience cognitive decline fare sort of as they go through that decline, we needed a measure of cognitive decline. For that, we used a measure known as the Total Word Recall Score, which is a measure of episodic memory. It is a okay measure to sort of understand how and when people experience decline, but also practically it is sort of harmonizable across these three surveys. So it helps us understand people who experience kind of similar types of decline, how can we compare them to each other? And to understand how these people sort of fare in terms of financial outcomes, we look specifically at non-housing net financial wealth. And we use that measure because we really want to look at liquid wealth, right? How people kind of lose money that is liquid, right? Like you can imagine selling a house is a big decision, whereas overspending from your retirement or decumulating is kind of easier and sort of you're more, individuals are more error prone to that if they experience decline. And within that wealth, we look at 4 types of specific wealth. First, checking and saving accounts, liquid investments, things like stocks, bonds, CDs, treasury bills, individual retirement accounts, IRAs, ISAs in England, individual savings accounts, and we also look at debt as well. There's actually evidence that, for example, respondents who experience cognitive decline, one of the earliest indicators is missed payments, for example. So we wanted to understand whether debt is also kind of part of that decumulation or part of how individuals might experience negative financial outcomes. So what I'm showing you here are trajectories of cognitive scores over time for a sample, random sample of HRS respondents. So we wanted to understand individuals' financial wealth, especially for those who experience cognitive decline. Now, there's really no clear way to really understand how or when cognitive decline occurs in these respondents, but for that we use a specific model, a change point model, which is a statistical method to assess when throughout a person's sort of trajectory they might experience decline. So there's a lot of evidence that basically individuals who experience cognitive decline kind of sort of slowly go down before sort of sharply decreasing and sort of experience more decline over time. So we're looking for that kind of elbow, right? We're looking for that break where that might occur. And so here I'm trying to show you the performance of our model just broadly. You can see there's all sorts of trajectories and, for example, well, I can't point really, but a good portion of our survey shows sort of significant decreases in cognition, and we can mark kind of where that happens using those kind of vertical arrows, vertical lines. So that's kind of what we try to do to kind of demarcate when people experience decline. So we want to assess wealth post and pre-decline and sort of look at that difference as a measure for sort of how much or how cognitive decline impacts wealth. So for the econometricians in the room, here I'm trying to show you kind of how we get at that. Essentially, we're trying to compare wealth in the red region for individuals to wealth in the blue region, right? And so we want to see if there's kind of a significant decrease between these kind of two periods for every individual, but also compared to individuals who do not experience any cognitive decline. We also control for some other measures that might confound the relationship between decline and wealth, such as age, gender, race, health status, and pre-decline income, just to sort of try to isolate the impact of cognitive decline on wealth. So, what do we find? First, as hypothesized, respondents in the US who experienced cognitive decline experienced the largest and most consistent wealth decline, and consistent that is across several wealth categories. Total, in sort of terms of total financial wealth, that comes about to $23,000. In England, we see a smaller decline in financial wealth after cognitive decline, and mostly that decline comes from reductions in investment assets. In Europe, we also see a smaller sort of wealth loss as hypothesized. We see more of the movement in IRAs. Across the board, we see no differences in debt. So people who experience the cognitive decline don't necessarily take on more debt than those who don't. Perhaps less surprising at older ages, but part of the literature kind of indicated that, that was kind of one of the impacts of cognitive decline. Okay, so here are just the results, if you like images. So as I said, individuals in HRS, which is the US, experienced the largest wealth drop, followed by ELSA, England, and share Europe countries. This is checking and saving wealth. You still see this kind of the same gradient, although in ELSA and share, the estimates are not as sort of precisely estimated. Liquid investments, same sort of trend as well. US individuals experienced the largest drop in their liquid investments, followed by England and then European countries. And then again, a similar trend in IRA, albeit European respondents here experienced a larger decrease in IRA wealth drop than those in England, which is not exactly what we expected. So we wanted to take this a bit further. You know, I've told you so far that Americans kind of experienced larger wealth drops due to cognitive decline. But what if we try to compare European countries within each other, right? So you can imagine, for example, some countries in Europe look more like the US with kind of more complex financial systems, so retirement systems, that is, than other countries who are, you know, perhaps simpler, rely on pensions mostly, right? And so here we try to do that by ranking countries on this complexity. And we use this kind of coarse measure, which ends up being not the best measure, but that measure is the total aggregated wealth in a country to the percentage of their people's income that comes from public and employer pensions. So the idea here is we're trying to sort of rank countries on how much restricted income that's kind of guaranteed in retirement versus kind of flowing from sort of accumulating your wealth. So we get kind of this ranking, which face value kind of might make sense. You can see countries such as like Switzerland, Denmark, Luxembourg at the top, and we think of those being more complex, looking more like the US, and countries like Greece, Estonia, Poland being at the bottom. To our surprise, so we tried to so let me just say, we break these countries into 3 tertiles, just to group them, right? And then we try to interact this grouping in our regression equation, but we do not find evidence that cognitive declines lead to systematically larger losses in wealth in those European countries that place more investment and accumulation decisions on individuals. Many explanations for this. Our measure is pretty coarse, you know, thinking through it, we might be better off, for example, getting specific policy data that describes the retirement plans, the pension plans in each of these countries, and really trying to understand how are these countries different. But also, people in those countries might also differ a lot, right? Like, we're trying to use a country description to sort of say how complex or simple a system is, but people within a country really follow very different plans sometimes as well. Also, there's other sort of social protections, cultural factors that might kind of confound those relationships. So you can imagine in Italy, for example, there might be high caregiver support, right? Some people might be there for their elderly, trying to help them manage financial sort of decisions. So there's a lot of factors at play as well. To conclude, we do find evidence that cognitive decline is associated with significant decreases in wealth, especially in the US. We find that investment and IRA-style accounts are particularly vulnerable. We think pension systems might mitigate those effects, though we don't see strong evidence of this when we compare European countries to each other. Moving forward, you know, as countries, especially in Europe, move more towards defined contribution plans, you know, we might want to think through, okay, what are some policies that can help protect those who experience cognitive decline? How do we help them manage sort of financial risks? How do we expand default annuitization, perhaps as a way to protect against the accumulation that is sort of not well understood? How do we add fiduciary protections, financial literacy, and caregiving support? So, thank you.